At 1546 on March 21, 1944, the M4A2 Sherman, its bow machine gun still frozen from dawn frost, sputtered and died at the edge of the small village of Verbivka, south of Uman, Ukraine. The diesel engine refused to turn, the starter solenoid clicking hollowly in the cold. Around the tank, the 3rd Guards Tank Army had been grinding forward for 3 days through Rasputitsa mud-soaked fields and forests, German Panzergrenadiers creeping through orchards with Pak-40 anti-tank guns zeroed on every farmstead. Then, at 1547, a burst of 88 mm flak from a concealed Pak position cracked through the Sherman's glassy plate, forcing the crew to bail out. One round struck the starboard idler wheel, throwing the track into a heap of mud. The tank lay dead, abandoned within sight of both friend and foe. The question recorded later in the 3rd Guards Tank Army War Diary was simple: how did this happen? And more importantly, could it be undone? By March 21, 1944, the 2nd Ukrainian Front had launched the Uman-Batasani offensive against German Army Group South, seeking to split the enemy lines and drive across the southern Bug River toward the Dniester and the Prut. Soviet planners had prepared for a spring offensive in spite of the mud season, believing that deep battle doctrine demanded exploitation no matter the terrain. Across a front of forests, open fields, orchards, and small villages, tank armies and rifle armies clawed their way westward. The 3rd Guards Tank Army was one of the spearheads, ordered to push armored exploitation in conjunction with infantry waves and artillery barrages. The ground here was a mixture of rich black soil and sodden clay, churned into treacle by days of warm rain followed by near-freezing nights. Vehicles bogged down constantly, infantry slogged waist-deep in mud toward the German defensive belt. The weather chilled to around -4 degrees Celsius at night and barely crept above 2 degrees Celsius by day, keeping the top layer of soil slippery and wet, seeping into every joint of uniform and machine alike. German forces, primarily Panzergrenadier battalions supported by Panzer IV OSF-H tanks and Stu-G3 OSF-G assault guns, had established a mobile defense in depth. Anti-tank gun teams lay in wait along tree lines, fields, and ruined farmhouses, ready to ambush the next Soviet column that ground westward. Their commanders understood fully the vulnerability of mechanized columns in mud. A crippled vehicle could mean death for crew and comrades. Each MPO, main position of the enemy, was mutually supporting, their mortar teams interlocking fires across likely avenues of approach. Sergeant Nikolai Ivanovich Rudikov, age 29, 3rd in seniority in tank number 2431 of the 12th Guards Tank Corps, was no longer a boy. Born in Poltava Oblast and raised among the vast wheat fields of his home village of Krasnohorivka, he had worked in a diesel repair shop throughout the early years of the war before being conscripted in late 1942. The first German salvo that struck his family's home in January 1943 drove him into the Red Army with equal parts grief and burning resolve. In the winter of 1943, Rudikov had watched tanks freeze to silence on the Dnieper's banks, seen engines die when oil congealed below -10 degrees Celsius and drivers curse when fuel pump diaphragms split from the cold. He learned then that success on the Eastern Front was as much about mechanical endurance as it was about combat tactic. He became known among his comrades for improvised fixes, jury-rigged block heaters using scavenged electrical coils, grease mixtures melted with flameless ration heat sources to keep gearboxes limber, and relentless experimentation with fan belt supports in mud and frost. Yet others on the crew mocked these ideas. Officers preferred doctrine over mechanics' tricks. Now, on this sodden afternoon outside Verbivka, Rudikov's skill would become the fragile hinge upon which survival and disaster teetered. The Sherman in question, designated MK-31 by its crew, was a Lend-Lease M4A2 diesel variant, prized among Soviet units for its robust torque and plentiful diesel supply, but vulnerable in mud and cold without careful maintenance. Russian manual and crew experience alike stressed that the diesel engines tended to suffer fuel pump freezing and cold weather lubrication problems when mud and ice crept into their systems. A broken fan belt in the cold could mean that the engine overheated within minutes of repeated starting attempts, frozen oil could congeal in the sump and refuse to circulate, starving bearings in seconds. At 1550, with the tank's hull cold and the crew exposed to fragments of German tracer in the trees, Rudikov dropped to his knees beside the immobilized machine. The cold mud seeped through his gloves. A Japakan anti-tank round from the pack's last salvo had smashed a section of the air intake grill, bending linkage and allowing water and mud to infiltrate the fuel pump. The pump diaphragm was torn, the belt that drove the generator hung slack. Electric cables were frayed where they passed through the hull into the engine bay. The sight was enough to send a lesser man into resignation, but Rudikov saw something else. A micro cliffhanger. Could he restore life to MK-31 under fire, mud, and enemy eyes? The ground itself seemed to conspire against repair. Though the morning had brought a brittle sun, by mid-afternoon leaden clouds had returned, blotting out warmth. The Rasputitsa mud lay deep as 400 millimeters in places, clinging to boots and tools alike. The smell of diesel mixed with cold earth, and every sound, from distant German mortar thuds to the scraping of a jack under a tank tread, carried with eerie clarity. German patrols could be heard shifting on the forest's edge, voices clipped, rifles slung, eyes scanning for Soviet movements. At 15:52, a German reconnaissance patrol on bicycles, unusual, but dictated by the mud, crept within 300 m of Rudikov's position, unaware that a mechanic was at work beneath the belly of a silent Sherman. Rudikov froze, breath visible in the chill air, heart pounding. For a moment, the world was only his own ragged breath and the cold whisper of mud against steel. Then, with an almost imperceptible gesture, he signaled the rest of his crew to stay concealed. Seconds ticked like years. Another micro cliffhanger. Had the patrol heard him? Would they report his position? This was the Eastern Front in spring 1944, a struggle not only of men and tanks but of machines against indifferent terrain, bitter cold, and the unforgiving logic of war. In these conditions, the smallest mechanical miracle could tip the balance between annihilation and survival. And here, on the sodden field south of Uman, Sergeant Rudikov would attempt one such miracle, to restart a crippled M4A2 Sherman under direct threat of enemy forces and in mud deep enough to swallow a man whole. But the next move was his. The crew gathered low behind the hedgerow, faces streaked with mud and diesel. Lieutenant Vorobyev, the tank commander, spoke in a tight whisper, his breath drifting in the cold. He had the cautious eyes of a man who had lived too long near the front. He knew that every unnecessary movement drew attention. Yet silence was just as dangerous. Somewhere to the west, Soviet riflemen were trying to establish a foothold along the dirt road. Somewhere to the east, German observers were marking every point of Soviet armor that stopped moving. Rudikov crawled back to the rear grille, his mind listing problems in the order they would kill them. The starter circuit had burned. The generator belt was useless. Diesel lines were fouled with muddy water. Oil had thickened inside the crankcase, turning sluggish as paste. And the right track lay half off, sunk deep into a groove cut by the idler wheel. He pressed his hand against the block. It was as cold as a tomb. Any attempt to force start it like this would shear bearings and seize the engine completely. The tank would become a coffin. At 16:02, the first German mortar round landed beyond the barns, throwing wet earth high into the air. Then a second, walking closer. The characteristic whistle became a rhythm that sank into the bones. Rudikov ducked instinctively. He had seen what shrapnel did to exposed backs. The crew shifted, glancing toward the tree line. They listened for the sound all tank crews feared, the hollow crack of a pack gun finding range. A brief pause, then another dull boom, closer still. The battlefield began to constrict around them. He opened the service hatch and worked by touch. With numb fingers, he removed the filter bowl, dumped the foul diesel into the mud, and wiped grit from the seat using a strip of cloth torn from his sleeve. He could smell the earth clinging to every surface. He cursed softly, not out of fear, but because mud in a fuel system was worse than any German shell. It ruined everything, and it never stopped coming. At 16:05, he found the torn diaphragm in the pump. The edges had stiffened in the cold. He had no spare. He closed his eyes and pictured the repair shop of his youth, the smell of linseed oil on the rafters, the way his foreman had once sealed a ruptured gasket using layered canvas soaked in fuel oil. Improvised, yes. But it worked long enough. He looked around for material. Only rations. Cloth. Leather straps from a kit bag. He cut a thin disc from the strap, pierced it using the awl on his pocket knife, and layered it under what remained of the diaphragm. It might hold pressure for 5 minutes, perhaps 10. Or it might fail explosively, spraying fuel across a hot block if the engine miraculously turned. He did not say this aloud. Another micro-cliffhanger formed silently in the mud. Would the pump seal, or ignite them? By 1608, the German patrol had turned back from the road, their shadows long across the fields. The crew relaxed only slightly. A stoogie could be heard idling somewhere behind the village, the low diesel thrum echoing off ruined walls. A second engine joined it, likely a Panzer IV. German mobile defense. They were preparing to counterattack when the Soviet push reached its limit. And here sat MK, 31. Dead. Lieutenant Vorobyov finally crawled over. We abandon. The infantry will cover. Rudikov shook his head. If we leave it, they capture. They bring pack, they use it to block the road. We lose more tanks. Vorobyov's jaw tightened. Orders prioritize advance, not miracles. Yet he hesitated. They all remembered the burned wrecks that dotted the snow fields of the past winter, wrecks that had once been fighting machines, then became German range markers. Every abandoned tank became an invitation. Behind them, distant Soviet artillery opened a short barrage. The air vibrated. Somewhere, someone shouted for stretcher-bearers. At 1612, the first cold drizzle began to fall, turning the upper crust of mud into a slick sheen. The track sagged further. The elements were not neutral, they always sided with whoever was least prepared. The real threat now was time. Rudikov crawled to the transmission nape and examined the snapped fan belt, fingers probing the frayed cords. Without the belt, there would be no cooling if the engine started. But starting was more important. He tied the belt ends temporarily with a wire twist he stripped from a burned cable, reinforcing it with an improvised lash cut from ration packaging. It was a crude brace, unstable, likely to fail if the engine ran long. Yet it would do to bring the machine to life for a minute, perhaps 2. Enough to move. Or enough to destroy itself. Another small cliff of doubt rose in the crew's eyes. At 1614, a runner from the attached rifle regiment appeared, half-crouched, soaked with mud. Panzergrenadiers massing at the orchard. Command says hold position. Armor to support when mobile. Vorobyov looked at his silent tank, then at the orchard. We are not mobile. The runner ran on, vanishing like a ghost. In that silence, the distant pack gun fired again, not at them, but beyond the tree line. The crack of impact carried back on the damp air. Someone else had been hit. Perhaps another Sherman. Perhaps a T-34. Loss always sounded the same. The problem inside MK-31, however, deepened. The electrical harness had scorched near the relay. The starter would not respond. Without it, there was only one possibility left, the dangerous, half-forbidden method Rudikov had once heard from a veteran tanker on the Dnieper crossings, manually rotating the crankshaft backwards to free the oil channels and relieve compression before attempting ignition. It was called, half in mockery, the backward crank. It was not meant for the field. It risked fractured fingers, shattered knuckles, even thrown tools becoming deadly projectiles if the engine kicked. If done too quickly, it could introduce air pockets and whip the congealed oil against bearings in the wrong direction. But if done slowly, patiently, it could loosen the grip of cold oil and coax motion back into the block. He whispered the idea. The loader, passion, snorted softly. Backward crank. You will break it. Then we surely die. The driver shook his head. Officers will court-martial us if we ruin the engine. Vorobyov listened grimly. Explain. Calmly, as if teaching an apprentice, Rudikov described the logic. The block had not seized, it was simply suffocating in cold oil and pressure. Turn the crank by hand, backward, a few slow rotations, and allow the oil trapped in galleries to move, letting diesel into the chambers with less strain. Then, using a makeshift jump from the auxiliary battery and hand-primed pump pressure, attempt ignition. If it failed, they lost time. If it worked, they regained a tank. If it slipped, someone could lose a hand. A distant Stu-G engine revved. A whistle of incoming mortar brushed the sky and struck the field not far from the village well, showering them with droplets of mud. The crew flinched. Vorobyov finally nodded. Do it. Carefully. Quietly. At 16:19, Rudikov crawled under the rear. With a wrench set scavenged from the tool kit, he fitted to the crank pulley. He wrapped cloth around his hand, not for warmth, but so that if the wrench snapped free, it would slide out instead of binding his fingers. He breathed slowly. He turned. Nothing. He leaned harder, using his whole body. The metal groaned. Then, with a reluctant shudder, the pulley shifted a few millimeters. He heard the faint, wet suck of thick oil retreating. Another slow turn. Then another. He kept count. 4 rotations. 5. 6. He stopped and listened. The engine felt different. Alive, but resentful. At 16:23, German rifle fire crackled from the orchard. Soviet answering fire rolled back. The battle had arrived. And beneath that rising storm, with time collapsing around them, a single Soviet mechanic, face blackened by diesel and mud, continued to coax frozen steel back toward life, one backward turn at a time, unsure whether the next movement would free the engine, or break it forever. At 16:24, the first Panzergrenadiers appeared, gray figures moving carefully along the orchard edge, rifles at the ready, machine gun teams dragging their tripods through the mud. They advanced like men trained to expect ambush and to deliver it in return. Behind them, a Stu-G3 settled into hold-down position behind a collapsed stable wall, its long 75mm gun searching for targets with patient menace. The Soviet infantry nearby shouted for armor support. None came. Radios muttered in frustrated bursts. The mud gripped every vehicle like a living thing. Inside MK-31, time began to thin. Rudikov finished the 7th backward turn, then the 8th, careful not to force the motion. He paused again, feeling the subtle easing within the block. The resistance was still there, but it no longer felt like death. It felt like tired metal. He climbed out from beneath and met Vorobyov's eyes. "We try." The commander nodded once. There was no triumph in it. Only necessity. At 16:26, the improvised fuel pump diaphragm was reassembled and bolted into place. The leather insert sat uncertainly, damp with diesel, smelling faintly of smoke. Passion hand primed the pump, each push delicate. Drops of fuel leaked at the seam, trembling like dew. If too much pressure built too quickly, the patch would burst. The auxiliary battery was lifted from the rear stowage. Its terminals were scarred but still held charge. Electrical lines were twisted together by hand, the insulation burned away in places. They wrapped the connections with cloth and grease, creating a crude barrier against sparks. No one spoke. Words made fear real. At 16:28, German mortars began bracketing the road. Columns of wet soil rose and folded back on themselves. One fragment struck the Sherman's hull with a flat metallic smack. Another clattered across the engine deck and vanished. The driver, Yegorov, slid into his seat. He placed his boots on the pedals as if approaching a deep river he could not yet see. His gloved hand hovered over the starter control. "Not yet," said Rudikov. "First, we prime again." Slowly. Soviet doctrine emphasized relentless forward motion. But forward motion depended on machines, and machines demanded patience. It was a harsh irony that many never learned. Outside, at 16:30, the Panzergrenadiers reached the ditch line. A machine gun team set up behind a fallen tree and began raking the fields. Soviet riflemen answered with disciplined bursts. The sound of combat thickened, not chaotic but layered, one more element in the orchestra of war. A Pak-40 boomed from somewhere beyond the orchard. A moment later, a plume of smoke rose to the north. Another Soviet tank had been struck. The micro-cliffhanger tightened, their turn could come at any second. Rudikov nodded. Now. Yegorov pressed the control. A brittle click. Then another. Nothing. The silence that followed was worse than any shell. Failure had a sound, and this was it. Again. The solenoid stuttered weakly. Inside the block, something shifted, but not enough. The battery, half frozen, seemed reluctant to give. Once more, whispered Rudikov, voice steady. Yegorov tried again. At 16:32, the engine coughed, not a roar, not even a growl, but a shallow throat clearing that died almost instantly. The fan belt twitched like a startled snake, then sagged. Diesel vapor hung briefly, then drifted away. Again. The fourth attempt came with a strained metallic complaint. The engine caught, for the span of a heartbeat, then stalled. The sudden stop produced a smell like scorched oil and cold iron. The loader closed his eyes. We have broken it. But Rudikov heard something only a mechanic listens for, the change in rhythm. The engine was no longer refusing. It was negotiating. He reached back to the crank pulley and gave it two more small backward nudges, barely perceptible motions, then signaled. At 16:34, the starter whined, the patched pump shuddered, and the block lurched. A sputter became a ragged pulse. Smoke crawled from the exhaust in thick gray sheets. The engine did not rev, it trembled like a wounded animal. They held their breath. Do not throttle, said Rudikov. Let it warm itself. The danger now was deception. The engine was alive, but fragile. Any sudden demand would tear the wired belt or collapse lubrication entirely. They had minutes, perhaps less. At 16:35, the Stu-G fired. Its shell screamed past the Sherman's left side and detonated farther down the line, chewing a crater into the road. The concussion shook the field. The crew inside MK-31 felt it through their bones. Vorobyov ducked inside the turret. Driver, engage. Slow. Straight out of the mud. Yegorov eased the clutch. The tank shuddered but did not move. The right track, half off and buried, resisted like a rooted tree. Rudikov climbed back out, mud swallowing him to the ankles. With the crowbar, he levered the sagging track while Yegorov applied the gentlest possible power. The engine groaned. The belt squealed. The teeth of the drive sprocket bit, slipped, then bit again. A centimeter. Another. At 16:37, a burst of German machine gun fire stitched the hedgerow. Chips of wood snapped past Rudikov's face. He flattened himself against the hull, then resumed. There was no alternative. The tank was shield and weapon, if it remained. The track climbed onto the idler. He signaled. Yegorov reversed slightly, then forward. This time, the track held. The tank lurched free with a wet slurp, like something being pulled from a grave. Inside the engine bay, the patched diaphragm fluttered but held. Fuel leaked in tiny beads, but the flow continued. The belt whipped unevenly, a thin thread between motion and ruin. At 16:40, the tank inched forward, angling to present its glacis toward the orchard. The commander's periscope swept the tree-line. He saw the Panzergrenadiers adjusting, surprised that the dead Sherman now moved. A Pak-40 shifted position, the barrels slewing toward them. Vorobyov spoke quietly into the radio. MK-31 mobile. Supporting infantry. The reply came in static and fragments, but the meaning was clear: advance to suppress. The cannon loader braced himself. They had high-explosive shells ready. Armor-piercing waited beside them. Dust and diesel fumes mingled in the cramped turret. Another microcliff hanger hung over the crew. Could a barely living engine survive combat? At 1642, they advanced out of cover, slow as a wounded bear. Fog from melting ground met exhaust smoke, wrapping the tank in a ghostly veil. The German machine gun shifted fire onto them. Bullets sparked against the glacis, rattling like hail. Target, Orchard Edge. 200 meters. High explosive. The gun barked. The recoil slammed the turret. The shell burst among the trees, scattering the Panzergrenadiers. A second round followed, tearing into the machine gun nest. The firing faltered. But the Pak-40 was ready. The enemy gun fired. The round struck the Sherman's left track guard, ripping metal away and showering the crew compartment with fragments. The impact rocked them sideways. The driver fought to hold direction. The engine faltered, then steadied, coughing smoke. Rudikov felt the vibration through the hull. He knew every second now scraped more life from the machinery. Bearings heated. Oil thinned unevenly. The lash in the belt widened. If it snapped, the engine would overheat within moments and seize. Yet inside that fragile interval lay their only chance. At 1645, another Stu-G round slammed into a nearby barn, splintering it into wooden shards. Soviet infantry surged forward under the tank's cover, using its bulk as moving protection. They shouted encouragement the way soldiers sometimes do when death feels temporarily manageable. The Sherman fired again, and again, methodically. Each shot pushed the Germans deeper into cover. The pack shifted, trying to obtain a clearer angle. Panzergrenadiers signaled frantically for armor support. Somewhere behind the stable, a Panzer IV engine roared into life. The battlefield narrowed to a corridor of fear and calculation. And through it crawled MK-31, alive only because one mechanic had dared a backward crank, an act mocked in barracks, doubted by officers, whispered about in winter camps, now the thin thread holding men between survival and obliteration. At 1647, the Panzer IV broke from behind the stable, its turret already traversing. The long 75mm gun gleamed wetly as it cleared the shadow, engine snarling as the driver fought the same mud that plagued every machine on the field. Its commander stood half-exposed in the cupola, binoculars lifted, cloak snapping in the cold wind. He saw the Sherman. He saw the Soviet infantry sheltered behind it. His decision was immediate. The Panzer IV fired. The shell clipped the top of a stone wall and detonated short, throwing jagged fragments across the road. A Soviet rifleman collapsed, his weapon spinning away. The blast washed across MK-31, rattling bolts and showering the deck with debris. Inside, Vorobyov's voice remained level. Driver, 5 meters forward. Gunner, armor-piercing. Wait. The loader moved with ritual precision, ramming the round home. The turret motor whined softly, aligning. The smell of hot oil filled the turret, sharp and metallic. Outside, the sky darkened with gathering cloud, as if pressing down upon the battlefield. At 1649, the engine coughed again. The belt squealed, thin as a scream. A frayed edge began to fray further, threads lifting. Rudikov felt it through the hull and resisted the urge to climb back into the engine bay. He could not leave his post by the transmission hatch. If anything failed, he needed to react at once. He spoke quietly. Short bursts. No long idle. Keep her breathing. The driver nodded. Sweat rolled down his temples despite the cold. The Sherman braced for the next exchange. The Pak-40 fired first. Its round struck the ground just ahead, skipping upward with terrifying speed, glancing off the glacis and ricocheting away. The sound punched the air from their lungs. Loose radios clattered. For a heartbeat, the world shrank to steel and shock. "Fire," said Vorobyov. The 75 mm barked. The Soviet shell struck the corner of the stable where the Stoogie had taken shelter. Wooden beams shattered. Dust and smoke billowed. The Stoogie edged backward, seeking another angle, its gun sliding past the broken wall like a patient blade. Another micro-cliffhanger formed, quiet but heavy. Which enemy would kill them first? At 16:52, drizzle thickened into sleet. White crystals peppered the mud, melting instantly, then forming a greasy slurry that stole warmth from everything it touched. The field stank of decay and diesel. Soviet infantry pressed tighter against the tank's flanks, moving when it moved, freezing when it halted, like soldiers orbiting a fragile sun. The Panzer IV advanced cautiously, gun steady. The German commander knew Soviet gunners were dangerous at close range. He signaled to his Panzergrenadiers, who spread out to flank the road, rifles raised, grenades ready. The doctrine was clear: distract the tank, isolate it, finish it. At 16:54, the Sherman fired again, high explosive at the orchard edge. Branches burst. 2 Panzergrenadiers fell. A machine gun team scattered, dragging their weapon further back. But the fire did not break the attack. It merely slowed it. Rudikov watched the heat wave shimmer from the engine grill. He knew the temperature was rising too quickly. Without proper circulation, local hot spots formed inside the block, silent, invisible killers. He imagined the bearings thinning, the oil straining to cling to metal. He bit down hard, tasting iron and grit. Then, faintly, he smelled fuel. He slid to the rear, peering through the narrow gap. Tiny droplets were trembling along the edge of the patched diaphragm. The leather insert had swollen with diesel. It held, but barely. Any sharp jolt might tear it free. And still, they could not stop. At 16:56, the Stoogie fired. The round struck the Sherman's right side, low, glancing along the track guard and exploding against the earth. Chunks of mud erupted like sea spray. The tank shuddered, then steadied. Inside, the crew held on to whatever they could reach. "Panzer," the gunner whispered. The Panzer IV had found a flank angle. Its turret locked. A breathless pause stretched like wire. Vorobyov's decision came not from panic, but from doctrine. Smoke. Now. The loader slammed a smoke shell into the breach. The gun thundered. A cloud blossomed, dense and rolling, drifting across the gap like a living wall. For a few crucial seconds, vision disappeared. Men vanished. Shapes became phantoms. Reverse 2 meters. Angle hull. The driver obeyed. MK-31 backed awkwardly, turning slightly to bring the thickest armor toward the threat. The engine protested, hunting, nearly stalling. The belt flickered. Rudikov pressed his hand flat against the panel, as if human touch might calm steel. At 16:58, the German gun fired into the smoke, blind. The round punched through the veil and slammed into a field beyond. Soviet infantry cheered hoarsely, then fell silent as the smoke thinned. The Panzer IV reappeared. The Sherman's gun, already waiting, spoke first. The armor-piercing round struck the German tank on the lower glacis, just where mud had stripped away coating. The impact rang like a bell struck in winter. The Panzer lurched, halted, then reversed, smoke trickling from a wounded seam. Not destroyed, but shaken. Another Stoogie shell shrieked past, missing by a span wide enough for a man's shoulders. It embedded itself in the road, exploding with dull finality. Stones rained. At 17:01, a Soviet battery somewhere behind the ridge opened fire. Shells whistled overhead, their timetable relentless. They landed among the orchard and along the German approach lines, heaving soil and branches into the air. The Germans scattered, seeking cover. The pressure on MK-31 lessened, not vanished, but bent. The tank crew breathed once, deeply. Then the engine hiccuped. A choking cough. A drop in rhythm. A new, ugly vibration that crawled up through the floor plates. Rudikov knew at once, the patch was failing. He ripped open the rear service panel despite the danger of shrapnel. Diesel mist gleamed like sweat along the diaphragm seam. With shaking fingers, he pressed a cloth pad against the leak, binding it in place with a strip torn from his greatcoat, tying it with wire as if binding a wound. He felt the heat radiating up his arms. Any spark would turn it into fire. Another micro-cliffhanger, one ember, and they would become a torch in the mud. At 17:03, he shouted through the hatch. No sudden throttle. Keep steady. She will hold if we respect her. The commander relayed the order. The driver complied, coaxing the stubborn machine forward with the gentleness of a farmer guiding an exhausted horse. Ahead, German shapes receded, regrouping behind secondary lines. The Pak-40 began repositioning, its crew dragging the long barrel like a reluctant animal. The Stu-G maneuvered again, wary now of artillery. The Panzer IV, wounded, kept its distance, probing for opportunity rather than risking another exchange. The battlefield shifted, not victory, not yet, but balance. At 17:05, MK-31 reached the shallow rise near the village edge. From here, the road bent, offering cover. Soviet infantry pushed past, muddy and grim, nodding as they went. Some touched the hull, as if thanking a living thing. Inside, the tank smelled of cordite, sweat, and fear. The crew's faces were pale beneath grime. Everyone understood the fragile truth, a miracle had carried them this far, and miracles were finite. The commander exhaled slowly. We hold here. Short bursts. Conserve engine. For the first time since the backward crank began, the mechanic allowed himself a thought not bound to the next second. He remembered the shop in Poltava. He remembered his mother's hands, cracked from winter work, teaching him patience with broken things. He wondered briefly if he would see that land again. Then the radio crackled. A new German movement. Fresh infantry arriving from the north. Possibility of armor. The order came, support, delay, hold. At 17:07, the engine trembled, wounded but obedient. The belt, frayed to threads, still traced its desperate circle. The patched diaphragm pulsed under cloth and wire. Every component bore witness to the risk that had begun with one idea, dismissed as foolish, whispered as dangerous. Turn the heart of the machine backwards, so that it might beat forward again. And still, the question hovered, sharp as ice. How much longer could it last? At 17:08, dusk began to creep across the fields. The sky flattened into a dull iron color, swallowing detail. The sleet eased, replaced by a heavy cold that slid into bones and stayed there. The ground stiffened slightly as temperatures dropped, not enough to help movement, only enough to make the mud crueler. MK-31 idled at the bend, breathing unevenly. Each tremor was like a cough in an old man. The Soviet infantry ahead dug into shallow depressions, scraping at the clinging soil with bayonets, helmets, bare hands. Their officers murmured orders, voices low. They understood the pattern of German defense: probe, counterattack, probe again, never allowing the spearhead to rest. Tanks like MK-31 were shields. If the shield failed, men died. Rudikov pressed his ear to the engine housing, listening. The sound had changed again, not louder, not weaker, simply different. The oil had thinned slightly with heat, circulating more freely now, but every rotation still carried risk. He could hear the faint whine of metal rubbing metal, a whisper of imminent punishment. He thought, without sentimentality, if it fails, it must fail serving. At 17:10, a Soviet liaison appeared at the hull, crouched low. Enemy assembling along the northern hedgerow. Mortars. Possibly anti-tank. Command says, support by fire. Do not advance unless ordered. Vorobyov nodded. We remain. The German preparations felt deliberate. Razor-thin discipline guided each movement. Figures slipped into positions behind logs, shallow ditches, collapsed barns. Small teams worked their way outward, seeking flanks. Doctrine in action: drag the enemy into a killing zone, then collapse it. At 1712, the first mortar salvo fell short, throwing fountains of mud before the Soviet line. The second landed among the trees to the right, rattling branches. The third bracketed near the road. Fragments scratched the Sherman's hull like claws, leaving bright scars. The gunner steadied himself. Range: 280. Orchard edge. They fired. The high-explosive shell burst among the hedgerow. Men scattered. Another round followed, breaking a machine gun nest. The Germans paused only briefly before continuing to advance in measured steps. The Pak-40 finally re-emerged. Dragged from its earlier position, it settled at an angle beyond the orchard, camouflaged by brush, barrel elevated slightly. Its crew worked with quiet economy. One man set the trails, another fetched ammunition, another adjusted the sight. No bravado. Only precision. At 1714, the first shot boomed. The shell screamed past the Sherman's right flank, plowing into the verge. Earth rose, fell again. The loader swore under his breath, then returned to work. Sweat ran down his collar though the air froze. Shift hull 10 degrees, Vorobyov ordered. The driver nudged the machine. The tank responded sluggishly, like a horse forced once more to obey. The engine stumbled, then caught itself. Rudikov felt the belt scrape. He closed his eyes, imagining each thread holding on by faith alone. Another micro-cliffhanger, one more turn, and the heart tears apart. At 1716, the radio crackled with layered voices. AT-34 platoon attempted to push on the left, only to bog in a depression filled with swamp water. Infantry there began pulling them free with ropes like peasants rescuing cattle. Every machine fought both enemy and land. The Pak fired again. This time the round struck the Sherman's mantlet, glanced away, and carved a burning groove across the sky. The shock slammed the crew backward. Teeth clicked. Knuckles split. But the gun still functioned. Return fire. The Soviet shell landed short, showering the Pak crew with dirt. They ducked, then resumed their calm rhythm, adjusting the sight with minute care. At 1718, the engine wavered. A hollow note crept in, the sound of fuel starving, pressure dropping. The cloth bandage around the diaphragm had darkened, soaked nearly through. Diesel crawled down in rivulets, dripping into the mud. Rudikov leaned in and tightened the wire, his hands shaking not from fear but from cold. He pressed the cloth harder, feeling the pulse of the pump through fabric like a weak heartbeat. He muttered a simple plea, not to gods, not to fate, but to the stubborn spirit of machines that sometimes responded to quiet resolve. The driver whispered, "She will hold, Sergeant." "For as long as we respect her," he answered. At 1720, a new sound approached, deeper, heavier. Tracks. Not the nervous growl of a damaged Panzer IV. Something fresher. Another Stu-G, perhaps. Or another Panzer drawn from reserve. Its engine throbbed at a steady tempo that suggested confidence. The Soviet infantry stiffened. Vorobyov scanned through the periscope. He glimpsed it only as a dark shape moving between barns. Not close enough yet to distinguish type, but close enough to tilt the balance. The order from battalion arrived, MK-31 to fix the enemy by fire, by minutes for the rifle regiment to dig in deeper and establish anti-tank positions. Hold at all costs. Withdraw only if destroyed. They all understood the meaning. A tank could become sacrifice. At 17:22, the pack fired again, this time aimed with cruel precision. The shell smashed the ground just before the Sherman, ricocheted upward, and tore a fist-sized gouge in the left hull. Armor held, but the concussion stunned. The loader's ears rang until there was no sound, only pressure. "Steady," said the commander. They returned fire, one deliberate shot, and the shell struck close to the pack, flinging one crewman backward. The gun slewed slightly. The remaining men dragged their comrade aside, then resumed. Discipline met discipline. The unknown German vehicle edged into view, indeed a second Stu-G3, its silhouette low, purposeful. Its gun tracked with slow inevitability toward MK-31. At 17:24, the mechanic felt the engine begin to overheat despite the cold. Heat radiated through the plates, warming his cheek in an unnatural way. Without the fan working properly, air did not move. Pockets of hell grew unseen. He faced a cruel choice: throttle up briefly to circulate more oil, risking the belt and diaphragm, or hold steady and allow the block to cook. No time to debate. He signaled the driver with quick gestures. A brief, controlled increase. 1 second. Then back. The move worked. The rhythm deepened, the heat redistributed, but the belt frayed further. A strand snapped, flicking across the grill like an insect wing. Another micro cliffhanger, each survival required a price, and the bill was rising. At 17:26, Soviet artillery shifted, walking fire beyond the orchard. Explosions stitched the fields. A gap opened in the German advance. The rifle regiment surged forward a few paces, occupying better ground. Men fell. Others took their places. The line hardened. The Stu-G fired, a clean, murderous shot. The round struck just beneath the Sherman's bow, gouging a crater and throwing the tank upward. Inside, vertebrae jarred. Instruments rattled. Something in the electrical system fizzed, then went silent. The turret lights dimmed. For a heartbeat, the engine faltered again, a dry gasp. "Stay with us," whispered Rudikov. The driver adjusted clutch and throttle gently, nursing the wounded beast. A faint vibration returned. Not strength, but survival. At 17:28, the gunner lined up the Stu-G through drifting smoke. The distance was narrow, the angle unforgiving. Soviet doctrine trained men for this: close, brutal engagements decided by seconds. "On," said Vorobyov. The round left the barrel with a dull thunder. It struck the Stu-G's upper superstructure, glancing, then shattered along the edge. Not penetration. But inside the German machine, shock must have been terrible. The Stu-G reversed instinctively, tracks grinding. The pack tried to cover its retreat, firing again. The shell tore through a tree trunk mere meters from Soviet infantry, showering them with splinters. At 17:30, the light began to fade fully. Night, the second enemy, advanced. With darkness would come confusion, flares, sudden shapeless threats. The Germans were trained to counterattack at dusk, using shadows like weapons. The Soviets, too, had learned its pain. MK-31 held its position, breathing smoke, dripping fuel, vibrating like a heart pushed beyond endurance. Every component bore scars: belt nearly split, pump bleeding, wires scorched, oil abused. And in the middle of it all stood a mechanic who refused to accept that machines determine fate alone. He believed, with quiet stubbornness, that understanding and respect might push them across the narrow bridge between failure and survival. But he also knew bridges collapse without warning. At 17:32, flares hissed into the sky, painting the fields in ghastly white. Shadows became longer than men. The Stu-G settled again. The pack re-aimed. The Panzer IV, wounded but alive, edged forward in support. The battlefield poised itself, balanced on the blade between catastrophe and endurance. And the fragile question returned, the same as before, but sharper. How much longer can one dying engine hold back a counterattack? At 1733, the flares burned like cold suns above the fields, hissing as they drifted downward on thin wires. Every soldier, every machine, every fragment of steel now cast a hard-edged shadow. There was no hiding. Night had arrived, yet light remained, the cruel light of war, chosen and controlled by the enemy. The Pak-40 fired again. The shell flashed past the Sherman's right side, close enough that the shock wave slapped against the hull like an open palm. A Soviet infantryman near the road dropped flat, face pressed into the mud, fingers clawing instinctively at the ground. When he lifted his head, his expression was empty, the look of a man who had just walked past death and knew it. Inside MK-31, the air had become thick. Diesel fumes, cordite residue, sweat, and a faint sweetness from leaking fuel mingled into something that felt almost solid. The mechanic's throat burned. He swallowed and returned his ear to the panel, listening as a doctor listens to a lung. The rhythm was now strained, uneven, but still there. At 1734, a message came through the radio, distorted by static, enemy reserves pushing from the northern road, likely Panzergrenadier Company strength, with armor coordination. The Soviet rifle regiment would hold, but they needed the tank's gun to prevent the Germans from forming a line of fire across the bend. Understood, Vorobyov replied simply. Orders were never debated. The Stu-G advanced again, cautious, using the barn remnants for cover. Its silhouette shifted with the flare light, one moment ghostly, the next sharply defined. Its gun settled with deliberate patience. Somewhere inside that armored shell, another crew worked with the same disciplined fearlessness, following their own doctrine, believing in their own necessity. At 1736, the Sherman shifted slightly to bring the gun to bear. The movement seemed small, but to the engine it was a demand. The belt squealed, thread snapping like insect wings. The pump coughed. The vibration intensified, as if the machine were clenching its teeth. Easy, murmured Rudikov. Easy, old friend. He tightened the wire around the soaked cloth another fraction, knowing full well such pressure might split the patch entirely. But there was no other choice. If the pump failed, all motion would cease, and the tank would be nothing but a dead hulk in the road. Outside, rifle fire crackled in short bursts. Grenades arced and burst with wet thuds. The German advance remained measured, not reckless, never hurried, each movement synchronized with covering fire and smoke grenades that hissed like snakes across the field. At 1738, the pack shifted its aim again. The gunner inside MK-31 watched the narrow sight picture. A line, a shape, a calculation of distance. He waited. Waiting was harder than firing. He steadied his breathing and let the crosshair drift gently, not forcing it. Vorobyov's voice came quiet, precise. Hold. The command felt like an anchor. Another shell from the pack boomed. It slammed into the low ridge to their left, spewing a fan of black soil. Soviet soldiers ducked, then rose, then fired again. On, said the commander. The Sherman's gun fired. The shell streaked through the night, a brief comet, and struck just beside the Pak-40. Earth exploded into the air. When it settled, one of the German crew lay motionless, the others dragging him back with grim, practiced movements. The gun remained. The gun always remained. At 1740, the second Stu-G tried to flank through the shallow gully, thinking perhaps the mud would hide its movement. But the soil there was treacherous, deep, sucking. Its left track sank, then sank more, and the machine lurched awkwardly. Vorobyov saw it, and opportunity sharpened his tone. Gunner, gully. Armor piercing. They fired. The round hit the ground just before the Stu-G, deflecting upward. It slammed into the lower front plate. The impact made the German machine shudder violently. A plume of smoke curled from a hull seam. Not a kill, but a wound. At 1742, the radio chattered again. Soviet anti-tank teams were moving forward with their own guns, hauling them by hand like ancient siege pieces. Everything depended on minutes. If MK-31 could buy those minutes, the line might harden before darkness fully consumed the battlefield. The engine coughed again. A sudden metallic scrape rose, then subsided. A smell like scorched bearings crept into the air. The driver looked over his shoulder, eyes wide. Rudikov shook his head once. Ignore it. Trust me. But inside, his mind raced. Oil film thinning. Heat concentrating near the journals. And with each crank, wear multiplied. Another micro cliffhanger settled into his chest. The next failure might not be slow, it could be instant, final. At 1744, the Germans launched their push. Flares burst again. Machine guns opened up. Panzergrenadiers rose as one and surged forward in coordinated bounds, firing from the hip, dropping into depressions, rising again. Behind them, the wounded Panzer IV rolled into motion, determined to press its damaged advantage. The Stu-G fired, the shock thundering across the field. Its round struck the ground directly before MK-31, showering the hull with mud and stones. For a terrifying moment, everything inside shook loose, tools rattled, shells clinked against their racks, and the radio squealed. The engine nearly died. The mechanic slammed his palm against the panel, as if urging a stubborn heart to beat. Breathe, he muttered. Just breathe. At 1745, the Sherman fired 3 rounds in careful sequence, high explosive among the advancing infantry, then another toward the orchard, then a third to suppress the pack's attempt to realign. Each shot spoke authority. Each shot said, "We are still here." The infantry behind the tank shouted approval, morale rising like a brief flame. Yet the Panzer IV advanced, angling to strike the Sherman from the side. Vorobyov saw it. He understood his next decision might decide everything. Driver, slow pivot. Bring bow toward him. The driver obeyed, gently, obediently, but the motion tore at the engine. The belt shredded further. A strip snapped loose and whipped itself into the pulley, flapping wildly. The smell of burning rubber filled the air. If the belt failed completely, overheating would be immediate. At 1747, the Panzer IV fired. The shell struck the slope of the glacis, glanced upward, screamed into the sky, and vanished. Sparks cascaded across the hull. The concussion rattled teeth. The Sherman answered. The armor-piercing round struck the Panzer's turret front. For an instant, nothing happened. Then a bloom of smoke burst from the cupola. The German machine halted, track still grinding uselessly, then slowly rolled backward. Whether destroyed or simply stunned, it no longer fought. A ripple of relief went through the Soviet infantry. But relief was brief. At 1749, the Pak-40 fired again, fast, angry. The shell hammered the road beside the Sherman, blasting open the earth. The blast wave slapped the hull. The engine faltered again, choking. That was when the leather patch finally tore. A thin jet of diesel sprayed outward in a bright arc, glistening under the flare light. The pump shuddered. Fuel pressure dropped. The engine stumbled, then caught again weakly, like a man trying to stand after being punched. Rudikov clamped his hand down on the jet instinctively, feeling cold liquid soak into his sleeve. He dragged another strip of cloth free with his teeth, wrapping, binding, twisting wire tighter and tighter until his hands ached. He knew this was madness. He knew that one spark could turn them into a torch visible for kilometers. But there was no choice. Either they burned standing, or they slipped away and left others to die. At 1751, the engine steadied, fragile, barely more than a whisper of strength. The rifle regiment signaled, anti-tank position established, line firming, German advance slowing. They had bought time. And yet, the mechanic understood with cold clarity, the moment of collapse was coming. The backward crank had given life. Improvisation had sustained it. But every miracle demanded its price, and their debt was almost due. He looked briefly at the silhouettes of his comrades in the turret, men who trusted without question, who never mocked him now. He thought of his village, of the fields near Poltava, of silent summer evenings before the war. He whispered, almost to himself, "Hold a little longer." Then he returned to the engine, binding, listening, coaxing, knowing that the next decision might decide not only the battle, but whether MK-31 would survive another minute at all. At 17:52, a stillness settled, the unnatural stillness that comes not from peace, but from exhaustion shared by both sides. The pack paused. The Stooges shifted but did not fire. Panzergrenadiers lay in the folds of the ground, breathing, waiting. Even the air seemed to hesitate. Inside MK-31, every nerve stretched thin. The engine idled low, nearly stumbling. The leaking pump throbbed beneath cloth and wire. Heat spread unevenly through the block. Steam curled faintly from the engine deck where melting sleet touched hot metal. A smell like scorched linen lingered. Rudikov sat pressed against the service panel, his sleeves soaked, his hands numb. The diesel had soaked through cloth, seeping into skin, chilling as the night deepened. He flexed his fingers, feeling them slow, as if the war itself were turning them to stone. At 17:53, a flare went up from the German side, brighter, higher than before, casting a stark circle of light across the road. It revealed shapes half buried in mud, broken fences, the outlines of dead men neither side could yet claim. In that harsh illumination, the Germans moved again. The pack crew resumed their methodical routine, loading a new shell with ritual care. The Stooge adjusted position, edging to bring its gun past the broken barn corner. Panzergrenadiers signaled by hand, silently aligning themselves for another push. They were not beaten. They were reorganizing. Vorobyov's voice remained steady. "Gunner, hedge line. Wait for movement. Conserve ammunition." They had fired heavily already. The racks were lighter. Each shell now represented judgment. At 17:55, the engine faltered, a slow drop in rhythm that felt like a man exhaling for the last time. The mechanic leaned in, listening. The pump whispered. The belt scraped in irregular jerks. He could almost hear the bearings protest with each rotation. He whispered again, not as prayer, but as instruction, "Do not rush. Do not fear. Work." The driver glanced back. "If she stops." "Then she stops," said Rudikov quietly. "We fight with what remains." There was no bravado in that answer. Only acceptance. At 17:56, radio reports arrived like distant footsteps. The rifle regiment's anti-tank guns had reached final positions. Mines were being placed along the ditch. Reserve infantry were moving up in small groups, slipping through the darkness. They needed more time, minutes, nothing more. Time was all MK-31 had left to give. At 17:57, the pack fired. The gun's flash tore open the night. The shell thundered toward the Sherman, passing so close that the air itself seemed to tear. It struck the ground immediately behind, carving out a crater that sprayed mud across the rear deck. Shrapnel hissed. Something rang like a bell inside the engine compartment. A loose bolt perhaps. Or something more important. The mechanic froze, listened, then breathed again. The rhythm persisted. He lifted his head and saw, through the narrowing gap of twilight and flare light, the silhouette of his tank's shadow stretching forward across the field. It looked enormous, and terribly fragile. At 17:58, Vorobyov made a choice. We advanced 10 meters. Nothing more. Support the line. It was dangerous. Movement meant risk. But remaining still invited precise fire. The driver eased the clutch. The tank lurched, crawled, lumbered forward like an exhausted animal forced from its den. The track bit the frozen crust, then sank into softer mud beneath. The engine groaned, but obeyed. The mechanic braced for snapping belt, for tearing pump, for sudden silence. None came. Not yet. At 1800 hours, the Sherman halted on slightly higher ground. From here, the gun towered over the shallow folds where Panzergrenadiers gathered. A sudden ripple of fire tore across the Soviet front. Grenades burst like low thunder. The German push began again, cautious but determined. High explosive. 200, said the commander. The first shell burst among the hedgerow. The second shattered a log barrier. Men scattered. The attack slowed, fractured. At 1802, the Stu-G fired again. Its shot struck the road directly before the tank and skipped upward. It hit the top of the hull with a heavy clang, then ricocheted off into night. The armor dented. The whole machine shuddered. Dust rained from interior seams. The mechanic thought, one more like that, and a seam might split. The engine coughed violently, then resumed, thin, trembling. Another micro-cliffhanger, one more demand might be the last. At 1803, the radio buzzed, Soviet artillery had recalculated. A short, concentrated barrage would fall across the orchard, but MK-31 had to mark the German gun by fire for the battery. A dangerous duty. Reveal your position, invite retaliation, and hope the larger hammer fell quickly enough. Vorobyov did not hesitate. Gunner, pack. 2 ranging shots. The gun spoke. The first round burst short. The second exploded nearly upon the gun shield. The pack crew threw themselves flat, hands over heads. The Germans answered instantly. The pack fired blind through smoke. The shell shrieked past overhead, tearing away branches and disappearing into darkness. Then the Stu-G added its voice, firing toward the muzzle flash. A blast hammered the field just to their right. The concussion slammed the hull sideways. MK-31 rocked dangerously, like a boat struck by a wave. The engine staggered. Twice it nearly died. Twice it caught again, barely. At 1805, Soviet artillery finally arrived. Shell after shell plunged into the orchard. The night filled with red flashes and the roar of collapsing earth. Trees tore apart. Soil geysered upward and fell back as black rain. The pack gun disappeared inside a cloud of debris. The German attack faltered, broke, then dissolved in fragments. Men crawled away. Others lay still. The Stu-G reversed, vanishing into the deeper dark beyond the burning trees. The battlefield changed character. Not victory, but release. A strange quiet returned. Only occasional rifles cracked. A distant machine gun stuttered briefly, then fell silent. Somewhere, a wounded man called out in a thin voice and was answered by no one. Inside the tank, the crew exhaled as one. Yet the mechanic did not. He listened. And there it was, the final sign. The pump pulse weakened to an irregular flutter. The belt, reduced to strands, slipped once, then twice. A hollow knocking began in the crankcase, slow, ominous, inevitable. The life they had coaxed back was leaving. At 1807, he leaned to the driver. Idle. Nothing more. Let her cool herself. They sat. Steam lifted. The sleet returned, faint, whispering across the steel. The tank no longer moved. It simply existed, a battered shape on a scarred road. Minutes passed like years. At 1810, the engine gave one last tired cough and fell silent. No smoke. No drama. Only absence. The crew did not speak. They understood they had ridden the machine to the limit, and beyond. Any attempt to restart would tear it apart. The miracle had ended exactly when it needed to, after the rifle regiment had dug in, after the anti-tank guns had been set, after the German attack had broken. Vorobyov rested his hand on the breech. She has done her duty. The mechanic nodded. He did not feel triumph. Only humility. At 1812, orders came: remain in place overnight as a static strongpoint. Use the hull as cover. Await recovery in the morning, if recovery proved possible. The men settled into positions. Some remained inside. Others crouched along the tank sides, rifles poised. Darkness thickened. Occasional shots flickered in the distance. A dog barked somewhere among the ruined farmhouses, then vanished into silence. The mechanic stayed by the engine, hand resting on the cooling plate, as if saying farewell to a companion. He remembered the laughter the first time he had spoken of the backward crank in camp. Superstition, they had said, farmer's trick. He remembered officers dismissing improvisation, insisting on regulations that the war itself constantly violated. Yet tonight, a battlefield lay shaped by a method no manual had ever blessed. At 1815, he closed the hatch gently. The night belonged to sentries, to distant flares, to thoughts men rarely spoke. And over everything lingered a question that would follow this tank, and this mechanic, long after the mud dried. Had they saved the machine? Or had the machine, dying, saved them? The night deepened. By 2100 hours, only scattered rifle cracks punctured the darkness, distant and uncertain. The sleet hardened into thin crusts along the hull, frosting every weld seam. Breath fogged inside the turret. Fingers stiffened. The cold became another enemy, quieter, more patient, infinitely persistent. MK-31 stood silent on the bend like a monument accidentally left on the battlefield. Soviet stretcher-bearers moved quietly among the shallow depressions, guided by murmured voices and muted cries. Somewhere near the orchard, a wounded German called out in faint, rolling syllables. No one answered him. The war would speak for him in its own time. At 22:10, a company clerk crawled up to the tank with a battered ledger. He took down the crew names: ammunition expended, rounds received, position held. The words looked small upon the damp paper, inadequate for the weight of the day. He wrote only: engine failure under combat. Tank used as strongpoint. Mission accomplished. Nothing more. In the early hours, faint stars pricked the sky above the torn clouds. Frost stiffened the mud into jagged ridges. The battlefield seemed frozen mid-breath, as if the world itself resisted dawn. At 4:18, a runner reached the tank. Recovery teams would arrive after first light. Engineers were pushing forward to clear the road. A new wave of armor was expected to exploit the breach further west. MK-31 would move if she could be made to move. If not, she would be stripped and burned. The mechanic listened, expression unreadable. He climbed back onto the engine deck at 5:02, as the sky began to pale. Frost glittered along the panels. He opened the hatch with softened hands, now swollen and cracked from diesel and cold. He examined everything with the detached focus of his craft: the ruined belt, the torn patch wrapped like a bandage around the pump, the scorched wiring, the faint scoring along the bearings. He knew the truth at once. The heart had given all it had to give. By 6:11, the first mechanics from the recovery unit arrived, smelling of winter cigarettes and fatigue. They circled the Sherman, spoke in quiet tones, argued softly over possibilities. One tapped the side of the block with the handle of a wrench and shook his head. Seized if we push. Maybe tow, maybe not. Command may decide she stays. Rudikov traced the line of the engine with his gaze, not with his fingers. At 7:02, a tow was attempted, cautiously, with long cables stretched like nerves. The hull shifted, groaned, then halted as if offended. A second attempt dragged the tank only meters before the right track twisted and snarled again into a rut. The officer in charge sighed, pulled a pencil from behind his ear, and wrote the quiet sentence engineers write when war moves faster than repair. Beyond economical recovery at present position. By 8 o'clock, orders arrived. Strip weapons. Remove radios. Salvage what could be carried. Prepare to disable. The work was methodical, respectful, unsentimental. Breach parts were taken. Instruments catalogued. The hull would remain as a fixed bunker for days, perhaps weeks, a silent shape among the hedgerow, protecting the bend where men died. At 9:16, the mechanic stood back from the gutted interior. The morning sun, low and pale, caught on the cold metal, gleaming faintly like frost on harvested fields. A commissar came by, asked brief questions, wrote notes, and moved on. There would be no medal recommendation. No speech. Only an entry in a margin somewhere. Crew performed exceptional improvisation. Delayed enemy counterattack. Contributed to stabilization of sector. The war diary of the Rifle Regiment added only one cryptic remark. Unknown tank held crossroads during German evening thrust. Enemy withdrew. And in a later captured German report, filed by a Panzergrenadier officer retreating west toward the Bug, there appeared another line. Russian Sherman disabled but continued to fire. Engine burned out. Crew displayed unusual persistence. Assault postponed. Different perspectives. Same night. Weeks later, when roads dried and fronts shifted, villagers would walk past the rusting hull. Children would climb onto the glacis. Old women would leave bread crumbs upon it for birds. Some soldiers passing through would run hands across the armor and mutter, "She fought." Then the salvage crews returned with acetylene torches. MK-31 vanished piece by piece, reborn as parts for other machines destined for other fields. And the story retreated into silence. Years after the war, in an archive in Kiev, a historian reading through the brittle pages of the 3rd Guards Tank Corps stumbled upon the irrelevant-sounding line about a mechanical improvisation enabling short-term restart during active engagement. No technical description followed. No name. No diagram. The historian marked it with a pencil, wrote a question mark in the margin, and turned the page. Soon even that pencil mark faded. As for Sergeant Nikolai Ivanovich Rudikov, he lived. He finished the campaign with a different tank and different men. He carried scars on his hands that never fully healed, and a persistent smell of diesel that followed him everywhere like an invisible memory. After the war, he returned to Poltava Oblast, repaired tractors, married late, planted a small orchard, and spoke little of the front. Only once, to a neighbor's son curious about broken machines, did he say, "A motor is like a man. Sometimes it needs force. Sometimes it needs respect. Learn the difference, and you may save something worth saving." He never mentioned the backward crank. He died quietly in the late 1960s, buried in soil that had once fed wheat and once absorbed blood. No monument marked the grave beyond a simple wooden cross and a rusted star. Decades later, a surviving crewman, the driver Yegorov, told the story to a researcher collecting oral histories. His voice shook not at the memory of fire, or shells, or fear, but at the memory of an engine coughing itself back to life because one mechanic had refused to surrender to the cold logic of failure. Without him, Yegorov said, we would not have been there when they needed us. And without the machine, we could not have protected them. So who saved whom? I still do not know. Historians debate the details. Some argue the tactic was luck. Others insist the method was sound, though dangerous. Some question the exact location, the exact timing, the exact unit. Documents argue with memory. Memory argues with silence. But the bend in the road near Verbivka still exists. If you stand there in the quiet between fields and orchards, when winter approaches and the earth becomes heavy again, the wind sometimes hisses through the reeds like breath through a tired engine. And the question lingers, carried on the cold. Was it the man who refused to quit? Or the dying machine that bought enough time for others to live? Perhaps both. Perhaps on the Eastern Front, where the mud remembers everything and the sky forgets almost all, such answers are not meant to be clear. The lesson remains, heavy and simple. In war, as in life, survival sometimes rests not on strength, but on stubborn patience, on knowledge earned with pain, and on the courage to try the thing everyone else calls foolish. And sometimes, the miracle that saves you does not survive alongside you.